3,000 proverbs of wisdom flowed from his lips like rivers of gold. Kings and queens from distant lands bowed before his throne in awe. God himself blessed him with divine wisdom beyond any mortal man. Yet his mind, corrupted by 1,000 wives, led him down a path of darkness from which there was no return. How could the wisest man who ever lived become the author of his own destruction? Despite all this greatness, Solomon had one fatal weakness: women. His desire for them clouded his judgment, and although he had everything to become the greatest king in Israel's history, his legacy would become a warning of how wisdom itself can be corrupted. God granted Solomon the gift of wisdom, and he made Israel a powerful kingdom full of wealth and trade relations with distant realms. But his harem was a lush garden made up of 700 wives and 300 concubines, each from a different corner of the known world. Princesses from Egypt with mysterious eyes, ladies from Moab, women from Ammon, Edom, and Sidon, each with their own stories and dreams, entangled in Solomon's magnificent court. Solomon's harem became a labyrinth of political intrigue and fragile alliances. With each union, Solomon sealed pacts that ensured peace for his kingdom, and each woman brought a piece of her homeland, turning the palace into a living tapestry of mixed cultures. But these unions were a double-edged sword, as they also brought the gods and practices of their countries, challenging the pure faith of Israel. What follows is a tale of how the wisest king's heart was slowly turned away from God, leading to consequences that would echo through generations. The story of Solomon's fall begins, ironically, with another fall. In the ancient city of Jerusalem, 990 BC, a prince was born, named Solomon, meaning peaceful and friend of God. But peace was far from the circumstances of his birth. He was conceived in the shadow of his father's greatest sin, for Solomon was the child of King David, the legendary shepherd who slew Goliath, and Bathsheba, a woman married to one of David's most loyal soldiers. Their story was marked by a dark secret that would echo through generations, an adulterous affair that led to betrayal, murder, and the birth of a prince whose wisdom would one day be legendary. In a desperate attempt to hide his sin, the king sent Uriah to war, ordering the other soldiers to leave him unprotected on the battlefield. As expected, Uriah met his death in combat. However, God's eyes were not blind to the king's actions. The death of David and Bathsheba's first son was seen as divine judgment, a punishment for the committed adultery. But amidst sadness and repentance, God showed his mercy. He forgave King David, and from that reconciliation, Solomon was born, a peace offering between heaven and earth. The young prince grew up under the tutelage of a wise and enigmatic man, the prophet Nathan. While King David dealt with the affairs of the kingdom, Nathan became Solomon's mentor and guide, shaping his mind and spirit with profound teachings and divine revelations. Nathan, with his penetrating gaze and calm voice, saw an extraordinary destiny in Solomon. Through his eyes, the prophet perceived the spark of wisdom and the promise of greatness that burned in the young prince's heart. But then Nathan began to weave a bold plan. The prophet knew that Solomon was not King David's firstborn, and there were older brothers who might claim the throne. Nathan also harbored a dark secret. He knew the full story of the adultery between David and Bathsheba, Solomon's mother. With cunning and determination, Nathan decided to use this knowledge to his advantage. In private audiences with King David, Nathan began to plant the idea that Solomon was destined to be the heir to the throne. With carefully chosen words and prophetic visions, the prophet convinced the monarch that choosing Solomon was God's will. When David fell ill and his death approached, he gathered the necessary strength to reaffirm his decision and name Solomon as his legitimate successor. However, the young Solomon, only 15 years old, knew that his reign was born under the shadow of threat. His father's warning words echoed in his ears, reminding him to be vigilant against potential enemies who might conspire against him. And so, with a resolution that surpassed his age, Solomon embarked on an extensive purge to secure his power. Joab, David's chief general, who had supported Adonijah's claim to the throne, was one of the first victims. Thus Solomon made it clear that no one was safe from his ruthless justice. He eliminated Adonijah, cutting off any possibility of conspiracy against him. But the young king did not stop there. With a strategic vision that surpassed his age, Solomon set out to strengthen the military force of the kingdom and embarked on forging an alliance with the powerful Pharaoh of Egypt. Thus, he took the Pharaoh's daughter as his first wife, sealing a pact that promised to strengthen ties between the two nations. The union with the Egyptian princess, wrapped in silks and exotic jewels, was a success. Unfortunately, Solomon thought that uniting with powerful women from other realms was the fastest way to grow his kingdom. This thought would haunt him later. But on a quiet night, while the young King Solomon lay resting in his bed, he plunged into a deep and revealing dream. In this dream, God appeared before him, and with a resonant voice full of grace, God said to Solomon, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Solomon, with a humble heart aware of the immense responsibility resting on him, responded, "You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong, for who is able to govern this great people of yours?" Solomon's request pleased the Lord, who recognized the purity of his heart and his desire to rule with wisdom. God replied, "Since you have asked for this, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be." Thus Solomon awoke from his dream, carrying with him the most precious gift a ruler could desire, the wisdom and discernment granted by God himself. This divine encounter marked a turning point in Solomon's life, enabling him to lead his people with justice, compassion, and unparalleled understanding. Solomon's wisdom became legendary, attracting people from all nations who longed to hear his words and learn from his knowledge. As it is written, "And all the kings of the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear the wisdom that God had put in his heart." This wisdom was reflected on a memorable day when two women presented themselves before King Solomon, both claiming to be the mother of the same baby. With tears in their eyes and trembling voices, each narrated her version of the story, clamoring for justice and recognition of her motherhood. The baby, oblivious to the dispute, lay in the arms of one of the women, while the tension in the throne room became palpable. Solomon, with the wisdom God had granted him, listened attentively to both women. Then, with a penetrating gaze and a firm voice, he issued a decree that left everyone present astonished. "Bring me a sword, cut the living child in two, and give half to one and half to the other." A sepulchral silence invaded the room as the attendees held their breath at the king's shocking proposal. Then, the true mother of the child, with her heart torn in love overflowing from her being, exclaimed, "Ah, my lord, give her the living child and do not kill it." In contrast, the other woman, with unsettling coldness, accepted the division of the baby. At that moment, Solomon revealed his final verdict: "Give the living child to her and do not kill it. She is his mother." The king's wisdom had triumphed, unmasking the truth and protecting the life of the innocent. The true mother, moved by unconditional love, had preferred to renounce her son rather than see him die, while the impostor had shown her lack of empathy and maternal affection. The news of this extraordinary judgment spread rapidly throughout the kingdom, and the people of Israel were amazed at the divine wisdom that dwelt in their king. As it is written, And all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. This episode became a lasting testament to the wisdom and discernment that God had granted Solomon. His ability to administer justice with insight and compassion earned him the respect and admiration of his people, consolidating his reign and leaving a legacy that would transcend generations. However, the people still clung to ancient traditions. They sacrificed in high places, on makeshift altars under the open sky, as a temple dedicated to the name of Jehovah had not yet been erected. Then Solomon set out to build the first temple of Israel, but at that moment he did not have the means to achieve the grand temple he envisioned. Then he embarked on a mission to forge a strategic alliance with Hiram, the king of Tyre, a city renowned for its construction prowess and wealth in natural resources. Solomon sent messengers to Hiram with a bold proposal. "You know that because of the wars waged against my father David from all sides, he could not build a temple for the name of the Lord his God until the Lord put his enemies under his feet. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side, and there is no adversary or disaster. I intend therefore to build a temple for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord told my father David when he said, 'Your son, whom I will put on the throne in your place, will build the temple for my name.'" Hiram, recognizing Solomon's greatness, enthusiastically accepted the proposal and committed to providing the necessary cedar and cypress wood, as well as the skilled labor of his craftsmen. In return, Solomon would send food and other goods to Tyre, establishing a mutually beneficial exchange. With the materials obtained thanks to the alliance with Hiram, Solomon began the construction of the Jerusalem temple, a project that would last 7 years. The temple rose like a dream carved in stone and gold, its foundations laid with massive blocks of the finest limestone, each one cut with such precision that no mortar was needed to hold them together. Its walls soared upward, lined with fragrant cedar brought from the forests of Lebanon, each panel carved with intricate designs of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. Pure gold covered every surface, creating a sacred space that gleamed with divine radiance. The temple's interior was a testament to human artistry, touched by divine inspiration. The Holy of Holies, a perfect cube measuring 20 cubits in each direction, was completely overlaid with pure gold. Even the floor sparkled with precious metal. 2 massive cherubim, each 15 feet high, spread their wings from wall to wall, their forms carved from olive wood and covered in gold. Their wings touched in the center of the room, creating a canopy over the Ark of the Covenant. The craftsmanship was beyond anything the world had ever seen. Hiram, the master craftsman from Tyre, cast 2 magnificent bronze pillars for the temple entrance, each 27 feet high. He named them Jachin and Boaz, and crowned them with elaborate capitals decorated with pomegranates and chain-like wreaths. The pillars stood like silent sentinels, testifying to the magnificence of the God of Israel. But Solomon's vision did not stop at the temple. For 13 years, the king dedicated himself to the construction of his own palace, a majestic structure that reflected his power and wealth. Solomon's palace complex was a city within a city, sprawling across 13 acres of Jerusalem's choicest land. The House of the Forest of Lebanon, its grandest hall, stretched 150 feet in length, its cedar ceiling supported by 4 rows of cedar pillars that created the impression of walking through a majestic forest. 45 massive columns, each carved from a single Lebanese cedar, rose like ancient trees to support the upper chambers. The throne hall, where Solomon dispensed justice, was a marvel that left foreign dignitaries speechless. Here stood his legendary throne, the like of which had never been made for any other kingdom. 6 steps led up to the seat, flanked by 12 golden lions, 2 on each step, symbols of royal power and justice. The throne itself was crafted from pure ivory and overlaid with fine gold. Behind it, a golden lion stood guard, its paws resting on the throne's back, its head reaching forward like a protective crown above the king's head. The king's private quarters were the epitome of luxury. The walls were adorned with the finest tapestries from Egypt, the floors covered with intricate mosaics depicting scenes from nature. Gardens cascaded down terraced levels, filled with rare plants from every corner of the known world. Fountains played in courtyards where exotic birds from distant lands filled the air with song. The scent of myrrh, aloes and cinnamon wafted through the corridors, carried by gentle breezes through windows framed in gold. Each day, Solomon's table displayed the wealth of an empire. His daily provisions included 30 cores of the finest flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer, gazelles, roebucks and choice fowl. The king's wine was served in golden goblets, each one different from the other, for nothing made of silver was considered of value in Solomon's days. The fame of Solomon's wisdom and wealth spread like wildfire throughout the known world. Kings and queens from distant lands longed to meet the legendary monarch who had transformed Israel into a prosperous and powerful nation. Among them, one figure stood out for her audacity and determination: the Queen of Sheba. Intrigued by the stories she had heard, the Queen of Sheba embarked on an epic journey to meet Solomon personally. Her caravan stretched across the horizon like a river of gold flowing through the desert. Camels laden with spices created a fragrant trail through the city streets. 70 measures of gold, precious stones, and the largest quantity of spices ever brought to Jerusalem. With an impressive entourage and exotic gifts, she arrived in Jerusalem determined to test the king's wisdom. She came with riddles that had puzzled the sages of the south, with questions that probed the depths of human understanding. "What is 7 and yet 3?" she asked, and Solomon spoke of the menorah's branches. "What sees without eyes?" she challenged, and he revealed the wisdom of the heart. "What moves without feet?" she questioned, and he unveiled the mystery of time itself. Each question was a jewel of complexity, but Solomon, with his mental acuity and divine knowledge, answered each with astonishing clarity and depth. The queen was amazed, watching this man whose wisdom seemed to flow from a divine spring. But it wasn't just his answers that left her breathless. It was everything she beheld. The way his servants moved in perfect harmony, each dressed in purple, finer than any she had seen in the courts of the south. The precise choreography of his household, where thousands served yet moved without confusion or clash. The abundance of his table, where exotic fruits from distant lands sat alongside the familiar bread and wine of Israel. She watched in awe as he ascended the steps to his throne, each golden lion seeming to come alive in the shifting light. When she witnessed the burnt offerings he made at the temple of the Lord, the magnificence overwhelmed her spirit. Here was worship unlike anything in her land. No idols, no graven images, just pure devotion to the unseen God who had blessed Solomon with such wisdom. "It is true what I heard in my land about your affairs and your wisdom," she declared, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I did not believe it until I came, and my eyes have seen that not even half was told to me. How happy your people must be, how happy your officials who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom." But even as the Queen of Sheba spoke these words of praise, the seeds of Solomon's downfall were already taking root in his heart. For his wisdom, great as it was, could not protect him from his greatest weakness. Despite God's clear warnings, the king was being seduced by the love of foreign women, amassing a harem unparalleled in history. As it is written, he had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. The majestic palace of King Solomon, a labyrinth of stone and cedar, hid within it a secret as vast as his wisdom, a harem of 1,000 women. Each was chosen not just for her beauty, but for the power she represented, the alliances she could forge. From Ethiopian princesses with skin like ebony to the daughters of pharaohs whose eyes held the mysteries of the Nile, each woman brought her own world into Solomon's court. The Egyptian pharaoh's daughter, his first foreign wife, dwelt in a palace built specially for her. Its walls were adorned with hieroglyphs that told stories of the Nile's gods. Its gardens designed to mirror the lush delta she had left behind. Lotus flowers floated in copper pools, and papyrus reeds swayed in the Jerusalem wind. But with her came the subtle influence of Egypt's countless deities, each demanding their own form of worship. Then came the Moabite princesses, moving with the grace of desert gazelles, their dark eyes holding the wild freedom of their mountainous homeland. They brought with them the worship of Chemosh, setting up their altars, where the evening winds carried the sweet smoke of their sacrifices across Jerusalem's hills. Solomon, in his desire to please them, allowed their shrines to stand. The Sidonian nobles followed, bringing the sophisticated charm of their great trading ports and the worship of Ashtoreth, their goddess of love and fertility. Their rituals were seductive, combining music and dance with promises of divine favor. Solomon, who had once written of pure love in the Song of Songs, found himself drawn to their sensual ceremonies. Every corner of the palace resonated with 1,000 stories, 100 languages, the whispers and songs of women from every corner of the known world. They were not mere shadows in his court. Each held her place in the vast political and cultural tapestry of the kingdom. Through them, Solomon wove lasting alliances, forged peace with distant realms, and enriched his knowledge of the peoples and cultures that bordered the confines of his map. However, this web of relationships was also a minefield of intrigues and jealousies. Each favor from the king could ignite rivalries that smoldered silently in the halls, adorned with exotic hangings. Each new wife demanded equal respect for her gods, equal space for her rituals, equal recognition for her customs. And Solomon, in his desire to maintain peace within his own house, began to compromise. The man who had built the magnificent temple in Jerusalem, who had dedicated it with prayers that moved heaven itself, now found himself entertaining foreign gods. The hills around Jerusalem, once bare except for the great temple, began to sprout smaller shrines. Here an altar to Ashtoreth, there a temple to Milcom, everywhere the evidence of Solomon's spiritual compromise. These compromises did not happen in a day. Like a poison administered in small doses, the corruption of Solomon's faith was gradual but relentless. The wisdom that had once flowed pure from his lips, guided by divine insight, became clouded by the intoxicating perfume of foreign worship. His daily walks through his harem became a journey through a marketplace of faiths, each wife offering her own path to divine favor, each pulling him further from the God who had blessed him with wisdom. The king, who had once sought God's wisdom above all else, now tried to rationalize his choices. Surely the God who had given him such wisdom would understand the need for diplomatic tolerance. Yet with each new altar he built, with each foreign ritual he endorsed, the clarity of his divine wisdom dimmed, replaced by a worldly cunning that seemed wise but led to spiritual death. Solomon's wealth continued to grow, even as his spiritual strength declined. His trading ships plowed the waves to distant Tarshish, returning every 3 years laden with gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. His merchant fleet at Etzion-Geber ruled the Red Sea trade, while caravans brought the wealth of Arabia and the East to his doorstep. Such was his prosperity that silver became as common as stones in Jerusalem, and cedar as plentiful as sycamore fig trees in the foothills. The king's wisdom still flowed into words that would outlive his empire. 3,000 proverbs sprang from his lips, each one a distillation of divine insight. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. His songs numbered 1,005, celebrating everything from the grandeur of God's love to the delicate beauty of garden flowers. In the Song of Songs, he captured the pure passion of love. Place me like a seal over your heart, like a seal on your arm. For love is as strong as death, its jealousy unyielding as the grave. It burns like blazing fire, like a mighty flame. These words, written perhaps when his heart was still pure, would stand in stark contrast to what his many loves would later do to his soul. But as his power grew, something began to change. The wisdom that had once flowed like pure water from a divine spring became tainted with pride. In Ecclesiastes, we hear the voice of a man who had tasted everything life could offer and found it wanting. I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. The cost of maintaining such a vast court began to weigh heavily on the people. The forced labor he demanded from the northern tribes planted seeds of bitter resentment. Young men were torn from their farms and families to serve in the king's great building projects. The taxes grew heavier with each passing year, each new wife, each new palace, each new shrine. Jerusalem itself began to change. The pure worship of the temple was now mixed with the sounds of foreign rituals. The hills that had once echoed only with psalms to the Lord now rang with the chants of pagan priests. The people, seeing their king's example, began to waver in their own faith. If Solomon, with all his wisdom, could embrace these foreign gods, why shouldn't they? The Lord, seeing Solomon's wayward heart, was filled with anger and sadness. He who had been blessed with unmatched wisdom and wealth had turned his back on his commandments and given himself over to the worship of false gods. God, in his righteous indignation, confronted Solomon and warned him of the consequences of his actions. Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. God's warning echoed in Solomon's ears like deafening thunder. The kingdom he had built with such care and wisdom would be divided and given to others after his death. Disobedience and idolatry had sown the seeds of discord and fragmentation in the nation that had once been united under his reign. Then came the prophet Ahijah's terrible prophecy. Finding Jeroboam, a servant of Solomon, who oversaw the forced labor of the northern tribes, alone in the countryside, the prophet took his new cloak and tore it into 12 pieces. "Take 10 pieces," he said to Jeroboam, "for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes." The very man who had supervised Solomon's building projects would one day inherit most of his kingdom. The divine judgment had been pronounced. Solomon's united kingdom would be shattered. His desire for women, his compromise with foreign gods, and his departure from divine wisdom had set in motion events that would divide Israel. Solomon, the wise and prosperous king, had succumbed to temptation and strayed from the right path. His example would become a warning for future generations, a reminder that even the wisest and most powerful are not exempt from falling into sin when they turn away from God's precepts. As it is written in Proverbs, one of the books attributed to Solomon himself, there is a way that appears to be right, but in the end it leads to death. The consequences of Solomon's idolatry and disobedience would echo through generations, forever changing the course of Israel's history. The consequences of Solomon's choices began to manifest even before his death. Enemies whom he had subdued through wisdom and might now rose again, like vultures sensing weakness in a once mighty lion. Hadad the Edomite, who had fled to Egypt years before, returned to reclaim his ancestral lands in the south. From Damascus in the north, Rezin gathered his forces, watching Israel's growing weakness with predatory eyes. But the greatest threat to Solomon's kingdom came not from within, through a man he himself had elevated to power. Jeroboam, whom Solomon had placed in charge of the forced labor of the northern tribes, now carried the prophet's promise of 10 tribes. The very man who had overseen the building of Solomon's dreams would become the instrument of his kingdom's division. In his final years, the wisest king faced the bitter fruit of his compromises. The walls of Jerusalem, though strong as ever, could not keep out the whispers of discontent. The northern tribes, long burdened by forced labor and heavy taxation, spoke openly of rebellion. The priests of the temple watched in growing dismay as more and more people turned to the foreign gods Solomon had allowed into the holy city. The high places he had built for his wives now stood as monuments to his failure. Each morning, as the sun rose over Jerusalem, its light would catch the gold and brass of pagan altars on the hills surrounding the city. The same hills where Solomon had once walked with God, seeking wisdom, now cast shadows of idolatry over the temple he had built with such devotion. Solomon's vast harem, once a symbol of his power and diplomatic genius, had become a labyrinth of competing interests and bitter rivalries. The 1,000 women who had once brought him joy now brought only strife. Each wife demanded that her sons receive preference, that her gods receive honor, that her homeland receive favor. The peace these marriages were supposed to secure had instead planted seeds of perpetual conflict. The king's daily routine, once marked by wise judgments and divine inspiration, became an endless procession of mediating disputes between his wives, appeasing foreign ambassadors concerned about their princesses and trying to maintain order in a court that had grown too large to control. The man who had once governed with divine wisdom now found himself trapped in a web of his own making. His sons, instead of uniting under a clear succession, formed factions. Those born to higher-ranking wives looked down on their half-brothers from lesser marriages. Those born to foreign wives brought with them their mother's gods and customs, creating deep divisions even among the next generation. The palace that had once rang with psalms to the Lord now echoed with quarrels in a dozen different languages. The expenses of maintaining such a vast court began to crush the kingdom's economy. The people, already burdened by heavy taxation, watched as more and more of their wealth flowed into the royal coffers, only to be spent on foreign luxuries and pagan temples. The northern tribes particularly resented building projects that seemed to serve no purpose except glorifying Solomon and placating his foreign wives. In his old age, Solomon began to perceive the true cost of his choices. His wisdom, once pure as spring water, had become clouded by compromise. The words he wrote in these final years reflect a man wrestling with the vanity of his own achievements. In Ecclesiastes, his voice carries the weight of bitter experience. "I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind." The temple, his greatest achievement, stood as a silent witness to his fall. Its gold still gleamed in the morning sun, its sacrifices still burned on the altar. But Solomon could no longer approach it with the same pure devotion of his youth. Each time he walked its courts, the memories of his dedication prayer must have haunted him. Words spoken with such sincerity, promises now broken. His enemies grew bolder with each passing year. Hadad the Edomite began raiding the southern borders, while Rezon of Damascus threatened the trade routes to the north. These men, whom David had subdued and Solomon had controlled through wisdom and diplomacy, now sensed the weakness in Israel's aging king. Like wolves circling a wounded lion, they tested the boundaries of his power, waiting for the right moment to strike. But it was Jeroboam who posed the greatest threat. This young man from the tribe of Ephraim, whom Solomon had noticed for his industrial spirit, had risen to oversee the forced labor of the northern tribes. The same hands that helped build Solomon's dreams would now be instrumental in tearing them apart. When the prophet Ahijah found Jeroboam alone in the countryside, the divine message was clear. 10 tribes would be torn from Solomon's kingdom. The news of Jeroboam's prophetic anointing reached Solomon's ears, and in his paranoid final years, he tried to kill the man. But Jeroboam fled to Egypt, finding refuge with Shishak, a pharaoh who no longer saw Solomon as an ally. How bitter this must have been for Solomon to see his enemies finding shelter in Egypt, the very nation he had first allied with through marriage. As Solomon's strength failed, the splendor of his court became a hollow mockery. The golden vessels still gleamed, the exotic peacocks still strutted through his gardens, but the king himself had lost his luster. The man who had once received queens and kings now struggled to maintain order in his own household. His wives continued their pagan worship, his sons plotted against each other, and the people groaned under the weight of taxation and forced labor. Perhaps in these final days, as he wrote the melancholy words of Ecclesiastes, Solomon finally understood the true meaning of wisdom. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. These words suggest a return to the simple truth he had known in his youth, before power and wives and wealth had led him astray. After 40 years of reign, Solomon, the wisest king who ever lived, breathed his last. When he closed his eyes for the final time, he left behind a kingdom poised on the brink of civil war. There would be no grand unified succession like there had been with his father David. Instead, the seeds of division he had planted would bear bitter fruit almost immediately. His son Rehoboam ascended to the throne, but he inherited a kingdom already fractured by his father's choices. The northern tribes, led by the returned Jeroboam, demanded relief from Solomon's heavy taxes and forced labor. When Rehoboam foolishly threatened to increase their burden, the split became permanent. 10 tribes broke away to form the northern kingdom of Israel under Jeroboam, while only Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to Solomon's son. The united monarchy that David had built and Solomon had elevated to unprecedented heights was shattered, never to be reunited. The gods of Solomon's wives would continue to plague Israel for generations. Future kings would struggle with the high places he had built, and the idol worship he had permitted would repeatedly draw the people away from God. Yet Solomon's legacy was not entirely dark. The wisdom literature he left behind, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs, would continue to guide and inspire people for thousands of years. His story would serve as both a promise and a warning, a promise of what human wisdom blessed by God could achieve, and a warning about the dangers of letting that wisdom be corrupted by pride and desire. The temple he built, though eventually destroyed by the Babylonians, would remain the spiritual heart of Judaism, its memory inspiring hope for restoration even in the darkest times of exile. And his own life story would stand as an eternal testament to both the heights human beings can reach when blessed by God and the depths to which they can fall when they turn away from him. Solomon's story became a testimony to the ups and downs of human life, how even the wisest and most powerful can fall into temptation and sin, but also how God's grace and forgiveness are always available to those who repent and seek his face. His life teaches us that true wisdom lies not in the abundance of knowledge or wealth, but in remaining faithful to the source of all wisdom, God himself. In the end, Solomon's greatest legacy was perhaps not his wealth, his wisdom, or even his writings, but the lesson his life taught, that all human achievements, divorced from faithful obedience to God, are as fleeting as the morning mist. The wisest king's final message to us echoes through the centuries. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come and the years approach when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. And so ended the reign of Solomon, the wisest king who ever lived, a man blessed with divine wisdom, yet undone by human weakness, whose story continues to teach us that true wisdom begins and ends with the fear of the Lord.